So good afternoon, everyone, to another Startup Central Victoria meetup and an add-on to our pre-accelerator masterclasses. But we have invited others to join us today. And our special guest is Tristonne Forbes from Pathwize. Now, you will have seen from Tristonne's introduction that we put out with the invite that she has great experience in this area, and I look forward to hearing more about experimental design, because we've been focusing on customer discovery, and we know we have to drill deep with questions with customers, but can we still believe what they tell us? So maybe the next step, which Tristonne is going to talk about, is experimental design. How can we test our startup ideas without costing us a fortune? But before we get started, I'll just acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we are meeting on. Could be Dja Dja Wurrung country, where I am, or Tangarang, or Yorta Yorta, or wherever you're dialing in from. That sounds very old-fashioned dialing in, doesn't it? But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Tristonne, because I'm really looking forward to hearing more about this. And thank you so much, Tristonne, for making your time available to us.
Thank you. Thanks so much. It's lovely to be here. I'm very happy to help out where I can. Just by a little bit of background, I've worked in the startup sector since 2015, and I've probably worked with really in depth with about 120 companies. And I've come across far more in sort of smaller ways. But what I've seen through the journey of all of those founders is that there's one central theme that keeps them all going and that sets apart the successes from the ones that don't continue, and that is their approach to experiment design. It's the way of testing whether or not your company has a place in the world or finding your way to that place. So I'm really excited to be able to share that process with you, because I've seen it unlock so much opportunity, and I've seen it help founders build their companies faster. So I'm going to share my screen, but feel free to leave your cameras on. It's always good to see some expressions, and feel free to ask questions. I could talk for hours on this topic, so I'm very happy for you to interrupt and ask questions. All right. So the importance of this technique and this approach to building a company came through really clearly when I worked with a company a couple of years ago, and they had spent over 2 years, and they probably had around 200 meetings with potential customers in about 4 or 5 countries. And by the time they came to the program I was running, they had not one single customer. That is a hell of a lot of effort and energy to go to not feel like you're getting anywhere. So within 3 months of taking on this experiment design approach, they found success. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about their story first, and then I'm going to let you in on the big secret of how you do this yourselves. So this company was called Invertigrow, and they were in vertical farming. So for 2 years, they had been trying to find a customer, and Kerry was alluding to, the customer discovery process. So their breakthrough came when they really focused in on the customer that had the biggest problem. And you can see in this image that customer is a warehouse. This customer is a major warehouse. It's millions of dollars worth of product every month, goes out to restaurants all around Sydney. The problem that they had was in summer, bok choy takes about 3 weeks to grow. And so in winter, when it takes 6 weeks to grow, they had massive supply chain constraints, and that affected all of the orders that were coming in from the restaurants, because the restaurants don't care whether it's summer or winter. Everyone loves bok choy. So with that knowledge, they were able to design their product to fit this wholesaler's business. And you can see these units here. They decided to compartmentalize their units. They plug and play. They send alerts back to the Invertigrow office if there's any issues. But basically, once they honed in on this as their first customer segment, and presented the customer with this image, they were able to get pre-orders of this product and their company was off and running. I should note they hadn't built one of these units yet. They had the technology because it come from a university, but they hadn't actually built these compartmentalized units yet. And they got the sales based on an image. They then grew very quickly, and over time they signed on more customers, and they are about to. This is one of their products. This is now a bigger compartment that they sell. So the product's evolving over time. And they also do vertical, this is horizontal. They also do vertical growth cubes, which you can see one of them here, which is in a Woolworths store in Sydney. So it may not be too long before we see these units in a lot of Woolworths stores around Australia. So I think that's a pretty good story, because what it articulates is that our traditional approach to launching a new product in the market isn't the most effective way of doing it. And that is when we think we know what the customer wants and we build this product and we launch it and we just hope that it's going to be okay. Instead, what we try and make sure is we get the requirements right up front. So how do we do that? Well, there's an order to this kind of experiment design approach. And the first types of experiments that you need to run are building a product that people are going to love. Once you know you've got that product, then you can start testing other elements of your business. But that's the riskiest assumption when you first start out, is does anybody care about this product? Is anyone going to buy it? Am I on the right track? So we do it in this order. And then once you've found that product, then you can test all the business model elements. And then you go on to the third stage of testing, well, what do you have to do to get this to grow really fast or big? So there's an order of that you do things in. And we run experiments. So if you've read The Lean Startup, I really highly recommend you do. It's based on a story about a software business and how they grew that software business. However, it has application to any type of business. You'll get some great lessons. Or there's also a podcast you can listen to on Masters of Scale, which is Reid Hoffman's podcast that Eric Ries, who's the author of The Lean Startup, has recorded with Reid, and that is a great place to start as well. But the principle of this approach is you build something, and we'll talk about what that something could be in a sec, that sort of product, and it's not necessarily the end product. It could be a video or an image, or in a Vertigro's case, there was that image of the warehouse with the product in it. That's what they built, that image. And then you measure the results of that image, you collect the data, you learn from it, which generates more ideas of what you then build next. So you're constantly going around this testing loop, which is why it's called the build, measure, learn, test. One other way to think about this is when you first start your business, if you think about risk, you've got this big bar here, which is all the risks associated with this company. There's so many of them. So you make a whole bunch of assumptions about the company. Your job as a founder, as an entrepreneur, is to test each one of those assumptions over time until you sort of know what works. And the beauty of this lean startup methodology is that as you test these assumptions and you know what is going to work, that's when you invest more in your company. So it's de-risking your venture. So the way we think about it is we make an assumption about what we think needs to happen in the company, and then we test that until we turn that assumption into a fact. And this is a value proposition canvas, and this is probably the best place to start. This is sort of your customer and your solution, and this fits inside. This is 2 of the squares of the business model canvas. So if you're early stage, this is probably the best place to start. So jot down all your assumptions on the value proposition canvas and then start sort of testing them And we're going to have a look at some ways you can do that in a sec. Just to like really ram home that point, the waterfall approach would be, if we're thinking about how do we test people's appetite from getting from A to B faster or easier, you know, a car, you could dream up a car and it would take a hell of a lot of effort to build that vehicle, and a hell of a lot of money by the time you get it in the market. And you can't actually test whether people are interested in that as a value proposition along the way. You can only test once you've built this big thing. An alternative way to think about that, you know, how do we get from A to B better, is to think about it in stages. So, for example, you could give people a skateboard. It's very inexpensive, it's very easy to put together, and it's testing the value of, do people want a better way of getting from A to B? And you'll find you've got a small customer segment for that. And if people lean into it, then it's like, right, we know we're on the right track. Why don't we make it a bit safer for people? We'll give it handlebars. And then if people really lean in and start buying your scooters, then you think, right, well, you know, how do we get people from A to B? How do we get them to be able to go further? We'll give them a bicycle. If people buy the bicycle, we're like, right, let's reinvest. We can keep going. We've got interest. Why don't we make it easier by giving them a motorbike? And ultimately, it's like, well, okay, people are really interested in this. Why don't we help them take their whole family with them? Let's give them a car. And so you can see it's a staged approach to getting there. And that's what you need to think about with your company, is you don't need to create the dream product that's got all the bells and whistles. You need to test the very first value proposition. So you can sort of think about your company evolving over time. As your product improves, you get more customer segments and more customers. You may lose the customers that bought the skateboard, and that's fine, because you've got moving on to other segments and other customers. Okay, so next we're going to talk about what makes a great test. The idea of a great test is you can walk away from it and you know for sure. And when you think back to our InvertiGrow example, they actually had a whole lot of meetings with a whole lot of companies, and they came out of those meetings and they didn't know until much later whether or not those meetings were successful. And they lived in hope that they'd get a call back, or that they'd, you know, eventually the meetings would lead to some kind of product, some kind of sale. They could have sped up their process of understanding if they'd created a mechanism that would have given them indication for sure that they were onto something or not. So you want your customer to lean into you. So there's three great elements, design elements of great tests. The first is you've got to make something to test, a tangible object. Then you've got to have this call to action. And then that call to action has to give you a clear yes or no. So let's talk through how that works. Tangible objects. Here's all the things that you could make. You can make a website, an email, a blog, mock-up of your product, a brochure, video, a prototype. You can do a little ad, a phone script even, a presentation, or with a pitch. And depending on what you're testing, you need to pick. This is only a tiny example of what you could be using. So, for example, if you're trying to get customer interviews, it's like, what is the test of what I need to say to get lots of interviews lined up? And that may be an email intro. So if you've been, I know you're all in the process of doing this now. So what is your email intro? What are you saying in that intro? Is it working? Is it converting into interviews? Or do you need to change the way you're talking in that email to get you more interviews? So even that's a little test. In your email intro, do you need to put a link to something? Do you need to put an image on it? Instead, should you create a blog and get people to sort of pop it on LinkedIn and get people to click on it? And is that the way that you'll find your way to your customer interviews? So there's all these different ways that you could be testing. It's just having that mindset is really important. And then how do you know for sure depending on where you are, you're going to get different measures of what we call traction from your potential customers. Initially, when you're early stage, you get that email right, somebody agrees to take a meeting with you. Maybe they're, that it's they're not interested, but they think that you're onto something enough that they're going to refer you to a contact. They might sign up to stay up to date with how your company's evolving and how the product's evolving. A really good idea sometimes, and there's an example in this deck, is you can ask people whether they want to come to an information session. Whether or not they say yes is whether or not they're interested in what you're doing. When you get closer to having the product ready, maybe you can get some customers to sign up to a trial. Maybe they'll sign a letter of intent. Maybe they'll start paying cash for early access. And that is the ultimate test when you're at this early stage, is you've got to get customers to pay for your product. And that's when you really know you're getting somewhere. So this is just an example of the types of ways that you can put a call to action into your test to see what the result would be. These are mainly B2B ones. And then this is the experiment design format you can use. So what is an assumption that you need to, what do you need to find out? And you can state that. And it could be one of the assumptions that you've popped on your value proposition canvas. And then you've got to design your test. And so you need to make something and you need to have that call to action. And then what result will let you know for sure that you're onto something. And you can actually write down what you think that needs to be and test that. It's much better if you think about these things and you write this down before you run your test, because it makes you more objective. And then after the test, what happened? And what did you learn from that? And these can be the most critical areas. What are you learning? What are you learning? And how are you integrating that back into building a company? All right, so let's run through some examples. Before I do though, how's that with everyone? Is that really clear? And do you feel like you've, yep, fantastic, thank you. I like the nods very much. All right, examples. How do you test customer interest? This is probably where you are at the moment. You're doing your customer discovery interviews. This is my favorite way of testing, is to try and plot your customers on this pyramid. Have you found customers that are right at the top of the pyramid, which means they're assembling a solution of parts because this is such a curly, awkward problem for them, and they've acquired a budget. They are the customers that you want to work with as fast as possible. The rest that are down at the bottom of the pyramid, you should sort of just leave them for now. And I've popped a way that you can test where customers are on this pyramid, which is 5 questions that you can ask during a customer interview. So you can have a look at that later. But this is one test: is where are your customers on that pyramid? How do we test the job to be done? That's another test. This is a company I worked with, and they were called the Big Feels Club, and they had about 4,000 people that were reading their blog, and they were trying to figure out, how do we productize this advice that we're giving people? How do we productize the support that people need? And so over the course of about 6 or 8 weeks, they popped these ads. These ads were placed separately over time, and to the 4,000 people in their community. And what they did was measured the response that they got. So did people want a therapist finder tool? Did people want a hard times planner? Did they want a therapy diary, or did they want a pocket anxiety coach? And so what they did was pop these to their subscriber base, test how many likes and shares and things it got. And on the basis of that, they decided they were going to build that style product for their user base. This is another company called Threshold, and they were all about creating products for major milestones in your life. And one of the ones that they were designing for was divorce. And so they had on Facebook, they joined some communities that were helping people through their divorces. And they popped these sort of prompts in there. how do you stay connected with your friends that are divorcing? Is this something that's necessary? And what kind of imagery do you put around it? And how do you sort of get a feel for what's going to really appeal to people? So they ran a whole bunch of tests like this. Okay, let's move on to testing solution fit. This is a company I worked with that came out of CSIRO, and they had created a product that was a substitute for dairy. And this was unique because it wasn't a calcium-based product. They had a substitute for calcium, but it wasn't a dairy-based product. Which is quite, it's not easy to find a calcium supplement. Everyone thinks of dairy, but there's a whole lot of kids out there that don't eat dairy. And this is what they were sort of like trying to tap into. So they put, in their customer discovery process, they created an ad and popped it in Facebook that said, do you have kids that don't eat dairy? Are you concerned about their calcium intake? And they got 250 people within 24 hours to sign up. Yes, we are. And then they systematically went about interviewing them as part of the discovery process. On the basis of the information they collected, they thought, right, we think we understand the problem here. We think this could be the solution. We don't know for sure. We're going to go test it. And so they engaged a graphic designer for about $75 to create the mock-up of a product. And they put it on a website, which again, you can do yourself really cheaply and easily. And they sent this out to the 250 people that had signed up previously to see whether or not they would click on it. Like, is this what they think of when they think of a calcium supplement for their kids? Do their kids want a jelly? Would their kids perhaps like this product in a muesli bar? Would they buy that for their kids? Or is it all way too soon to get them to buy any of these things, and we should just offer a sample pack? So this is one of the ways that they tested it. And when they designed their experiment, they used the experiment design template. They popped their expected result of, we think at least 50% of the people on our list are going to opt to pre-purchase these products. And you just have to pull a number out of the air. You're not going to know for sure what number this is going to be. And then when you get the test result back, you think, oh, right, okay, so we got 50% of people clicking on our email, but we only got, 15% people pre-purchasing. Is that a good result? We were hoping for 50%. We got 15. What does that mean? And as you run these tests over time, you get better at coming up with the numbers that are going to give you the right kind of indication of whether you're onto something. And after running this test, you might want to go back to some of the people that didn't click on it and just find out why. Maybe because that's where you get the most learnings. What did you learn from this test? What about this offer wasn't right? Or what about it was right? And just keep learning. Here's another one. This was a startup I worked with out of Melbourne University, and they were into geothermal energy, and they wanted to put geothermal into big construction projects around Melbourne. But to do that, you've got to get big construction involved. Because they were Melbourne University, they were able to offer an information session. And the first test was, is the big construction sector even interested in geothermal? Let's run a session that's going to showcase some of this new technology and see how many people show up. Well, you can see quite a lot of people showed up. So tick for that experiment. And then while they were in the session, they provided value to these people. They they provided lots of info about it, but they also ran tests, like, do you think this is something you'd consider for your big projects? And the green cards were for yes, and the red cards were for no. And so this was one way of testing as well. The other thing they had to test was these sectors, the different sectors of the construction industry had to work together to get this product in these new builds. Did they think that they could do that? So they ran some tests in the meeting, and then they ran tests after the meeting. Did everyone just get caught up in the spirit of it? Now that the meeting's over, are they still going to engage? What way will they engage? How long is this going to take? Testing. and it got too hard, and they decided to go and do something else because it was going to take too long, and there was too much resistance. Or actually, there wasn't too much. There was too many big systemic objects that they would have to overcome, and so the founders went off to do something else. Isn't it great that they know that, though? This is another company that I worked with out of University of Melbourne, and they were working with stroke patients, and they were helping them to get their mobility back. They were talking to healthcare centres, and they were trying to sign some customers up for pilots and for trials. The problem was they had this very antiquated device in the lab. It wasn't very inspiring, and they really struggled to get the healthcare centres to understand what the product would be like in its final form, enough to sort of go, actually, yeah, this is something that we'd be interested in exploring. So you can see this is a very expensive piece of machinery to build. This would have been a couple of $100,000 to get it right with all the machine tooling and everything. And so they're a tiny startup. They haven't got that money. So what did they do? Well, they went to an industrial design firm, and they had an industrial design firm draw this for them conceptually, and then put it into their magnificent rendering software and create an image of what the final product would be. So instead of $200,000 or $300,000 and being a bit like the car scenario, building the product before you actually like really in depth know what it needs to be able to do, they spent instead $5,000 on getting this render done. And on the basis of this render, they got some healthcare centres signed up. It's a much better option. Okay, now this is another company that I worked with out of CSIRO, and they're now doing incredibly well in the biosecurity space. This is an image of a fruit fly, and this company was helping to eradicate fruit flies from farms. When they originally started working on what the solution should be, they thought that growers would need to see a picture of the fruit fly to actually confirm, yes, that's exactly what it is. And this company is called RapidAim. And when I first started working with them, because they were so fixated on this, providing this image, I thought their technology was like facial recognition software for fruit flies. And they were trying to put this camera in this fruit fly trap, and it was very complicated, and it was a really big deal. What I learned, though, from talking to them further was that the way that they could test whether the fruit fly was in the trap wasn't anything to do with the camera. They had a special film, and fruit flies do this little dance, and it's the little dance that indicates it's a fruit fly, not an image. So they were fixated on having a photo in there because they thought that's what their customer wanted to see. Turns out, when they tested this with growers, this was all fake, and they said, we're going to just, we're going to just want to see your reaction, when we sort of test out this product. And they were just sending them this image. Look, there's a fruit fly in trap number 52, and here's the coordinates for that, and this is the date that we've detected it. Now, what are you going to do? They wanted to know how the grower would react. And when they followed up with the grower afterwards, they realised they did not want to see photos of fruit flies. They, turns out, not surprisingly, didn't like fruit flies. The less of them they saw, the better. And so this enabled the product design to go in a completely different direction. And over time, and through co-creation with customers, they've had different iterations of the product, much simpler. And now you can see it's evolving, and you can see the fruit flies coming from other properties to yours, and you can know when it's the right time to act. So this is a much more sophisticated product based on testing with customers. So when you're building a test like this, the key things to consider is how can you do it cheaply, how can you do it quickly, and how can you do it flexibly. Instead of spending 2 weeks designing a test and getting it ready and getting it out there, what can you do in an afternoon? Instead of spending thousands of dollars. What can you do for a couple of hundred? These are all things to, to really test your mental muscle to how can you do this more simply, but still test the value proposition. And you may need to test it a few ways. So how can you create something that's flexible? And the best way when you're in your early stages is you probably some of you may recognize this from a very, very old movie. This is The Wizard of Oz. And this was this is a process that the early entrepreneurs picked up on, is the fact when you watch this movie, you think that there's this big booming voice and there's all these special effects. But when you pull back the curtain, there's this man behind the scenes just pulling all the levers manually. It's not what it seems. And so this is a great technique for startups, is you can have this beautiful product that to a customer looks like it's got all the bells and whistles, but you're actually activating all of those elements yourself behind the scenes manually. This is an example of a company that was doing a data analysis product, and they were trying to, instead of it being a static data analysis at a certain period in time, they were trying to see if they could sign up customers to a dashboard where the data's constantly updated. And so to do that, they could have built the software engine behind it, but that would again have taken a whole lot of extra money and a whole lot of time to do it, and they didn't even know whether their customers really wanted it yet. So instead, they'd get the customers' data every day, and they would physically add it to all of the dashboards and then send it out to customers. So it was a very manual process, but it was testing the value proposition. And it was only after they confirmed that it was valuable that they would then build the whole software engine that sat behind it. And so this is a really clever way of operating, and it's becoming easier and easier because there's a whole lot of no-code platforms out there that even help you automate some of that. So when you think about, do you want to sell products online? For example, let's take that as a really good example. E-commerce. Shopify has revolutionized e-commerce because you don't need to build your own website with a payment gateway and all the bells and whistles of an e-commerce website now. You can test an e-commerce concept by signing up to Spotify, paying a couple of $100 and getting your e-commerce store up and running pretty quickly and pretty cheaply. So if you think of that Spotify as a tool, as a no-code tool, you don't have to do any coding. There are dozens of these tools now in the market, and I highly recommend with your marketing automation or your acceptance emails, thank you, yes, we're looking forward to working with you, or whatever it is that you need to automate to make your Wizard of Oz style product that you're testing with customers, you'll probably find a no-code tool that will help you. So highly recommend you looking. And when you're testing user experience, honestly, these low fidelity things can be really useful, and get people, get a couple of pilot customers to just point to where they would press next or what their brains would be thinking next. You can even do it with hardware by, mock-ups like this. So, be inventive about the way that you're testing. All right, that's almost it. I'm just going to leave you with a couple of top tips just to recap. The first one is there is an order of priority. The first thing you have to do, and the riskiest assumption for your company, is can you build a product that people will love? And so all your testing and your customer discovery all needs to be in this spot first. And it's then that you go and test all the other elements of your business model and how your, whatever growth engine you're going to add to it. The second top tip, turn assumptions to fact. Really try and think, what am I assuming? And then how can I build a test for that? Use the experiment design technique to build a test. And make sure that, because the more you know, the less risky your business venture becomes. And the final thing is build really smart tests, like Mezzo did, fast to make, low cost, flexible, that still give customers the value proposition that you're thinking they want, so that your test is real, it's appropriate. My final tip for you is never stop testing. You can integrate this kind of testing mindset into your business for the long term. Businesses are never static, they evolve. And over time, if you just keep testing and thinking about everything you do in a testing way, you'll continue to have success. Okay.
That was fabulous. Thank you, Tristonne. I love the way you just skipped through that. You made it seem so easy. But I'm wondering if anyone that has tuned in today to get those pearls of wisdom has any questions that they'd like to ask. They're very welcome to put their video up.
Yeah, please. You're welcome to ask questions. And this deck, you can all have access to. We can put a link in the channel, and that can help sort of, when you come back to it, can help you remind you of different ways that you can run tests. And you can also perhaps see if you can find some examples online in some startup communities.
I love the little mock-up with the just sticky taping over the buttons, which almost we could probably find in our kids' toy boxes, something along those lines. They have modern technology that we can use, but it's how can we get people to mimic what they'd actually do, and taking it that step further. So it was very good. And the fact that it's so easy, so many easy ways that we can do it. In terms of what do you think is the biggest mistake that people make, Tristonne? You talked about a few different ways, but what do you think is the number one failure of startups that I guess are so caught up in this wonderful idea that they've got?
Right. Absolutely. Good. Yeah, great question. I think the biggest problem that startups have is when they go out into the market, they go out trying to prove themselves right.
Yes.
And if you instead go out in the market and try and get really objective feedback, it's a totally different experience.
Yeah.
So, this is quite a scientific method, this experiment design method. And, if you go into sort of research fundamentals, the researchers in our universities, their experiment design approach, they deliberately design experiments to fail in the lab. They want them to fail because then if an experiment doesn't fail, they'll go, wow, oh, okay, that's interesting. Why did that work? And I think it's something to keep in mind is just to have that objectivity and not go out and prove yourself right.
And I guess the customer discovery is very much about testing. That's part of your testing your assumptions. And based on that, you then move to doing a prototype and testing which one, does it actually solve the problem that they said they were interested in, and coming up from that perspective. But yes, it's we all think we've got that gold nugget and we get excited about it because we know, but it's about how people actually pay for it.
It can actually be quite confronting too, because if you try and test something, and it doesn't come back as a big tick, then you kind of have to face that fact, and you have to sort of figure out another way of building, or it can be quite confronting, which is why it's great to have sort of founder friends, because you can share all of this and you can share different ways of testing things, and it becomes a real skill of an entrepreneur is this way of thinking and this different options for getting answers from the market.
And that acceptance that, yes, that failed, but that's actually another step towards finding a way forward. And just imagine the excitement when that test finally comes back and it is good. Now, Simon, I see, has his hand up. What's your question, Simon?
Yeah, so I was the idea of testing a new product or service on potential customers and your mention of testing for failure is that's like I don't like using the word paradigm shift because it reminds me of something completely different. But from my experience interacting with test teams on systems that I'd been working on, the objective of the exercise for the test team was to break it, to make sure that what you put together was actually going to fulfill the requirements of the customer. But in this, we're looking at this in a slightly different way, that we want to design tests so that the potential clients can define the product or service that they want. And so it's possibly less putting myself on the ledge, waiting to get pushed off by a potential customer, whereas I'm asking them, this is my idea for a product or service. What do you reckon?
Yes, absolutely. But even before that, if you're in customer discovery mode, here's a great example. If you are talking to a customer and you're trying to figure out whether they're a potential customer and plot them on that pyramid, you want them to do all the talking. You don't want, and so you then want to be able to take that objective information that they give you to figure out, are they a customer? And if they are, what's the product that would solve their problem? It's a very different approach to if you go into a customer interview and you tell them about your idea. As soon as you tell them about your idea, they're going to give you feedback as opposed to a good indication of whether or not they're a customer. So, for example, if somebody asks me about sneakers, I can, like here, I've got these great sneakers. I will go into feedback mode. Oh, I like the color. Oh, yeah, good. I like the laces, whatever. Anybody can do that. But that's not testing whether or not I'm going to buy sneakers. Instead, if you go into a customer interview and say, what's the biggest challenge with, your footwear? And they might say, I really don't like hard things. They scratch my feet. I get blisters all the time. Oh, right. And then you can go away and say, I reckon this customer might like a sneaker. Couple of weeks go past, you go back to the customer and say, look at this. What do you think of this shoe? And that's the sort of sequence of testing. So, you're getting that really objective feedback.
So before you invest all the product development effort and expense, is to try and get the customer to pretty much help with the design for you, get them to do as much of the design work as you can before you, and I guess that's the dynamic risk assessment that we were looking at earlier on with the graph with the bar of risk and investment, is to work with potentials to say, how can I take the risk out of this concept that I love so much and want to take to market?
Yep. Nailed it.
Okay, cool.
And from a customer point of view, that engagement, I think, would be very useful too. I'd be flattered if someone asked my opinion on, a problem or what I'd like, and then they come back and say, well, what do you think of this? I think that's a process of engagement too, that they were listening to me and they've responded. And even if you had a good idea of what you were going to take to them in the beginning, but that engagement is very important, particularly with a new startup. Now, is there any other questions? We're getting towards the end.
Jess?
Jess.
I've got one more example for you.
Hi. I actually wanted to just kind of add a little bit more flavor to that concept of experiment design. And I have a session that I run sometimes about treating your life like you're a scientist. And it's like that idea of running experiments and whatnot. And this might help Simon a little bit with that paradigm shift of the idea that it's not a failure, it's all just more data. It removes that emotional sort of component to it. We're just collecting data. It's not pass or fail. There's no emotional kind of component to it. It's all just more data that helps us to move through that next step.
Absolutely. That's brilliant, Jess. I'm so glad you mentioned that. There's a slide that I realized I left out of my deck, which is, you know, when you run a test and it fails, you've learned something. When you run a test and it succeeds, you've learned something, and they are equal. Well, actually, the test that fails is probably more useful because you tend to analyze that one more. But there's a concept that you may have heard of, which is called flirting. It's not failing, it's flirting. But just one more example that I was thinking of, one of the companies I worked with was telling the story about another founder, and that founder was creating something for a farmer, for farmers, and found this farmer that, you know, was really interested in the product. And so they started co-creating it together. And, you know, it ended up really friendly, and this founder would sort of end up having, you know, meals with the family, and as the product evolved, it got to a point where it was ready for sale, and the founder, you know, went back to the farmer thinking that he was going to be the first customer. He got a very different reception. Farmer met him at the gate, which was closed, leaning over it, chatting to him, saying, "Look, I've been happy to help you, but I never had any intention of purchasing it." So just be careful.
And I guess that's understanding who is a mentor or an ambassador wanting to assist you, as opposed to a potential customer. And obviously the farmer saw that as a very different relationship. So cautionary tale to end on,
Yes.
But lots of food for thought. I don't think there's any more hands up that I can see. But I'd just like to thank you so much, Tristonne. That was just so articulate, to the point. You've got us all on the same page, and raring to go with a much clearer vision of how we can experiment and test our startup ideas without costing a fortune and without taking years. And that's what we love with entrepreneurs. They're fast, they're speedy, they're nimble, agile, all of those things. And you've just demonstrated beautifully how we can do that. So thank you, everyone, for giving up your lunchtime, and particularly you, Tristonne. It's been a treat talking with you. Thank you so much.
Been great. Thanks again. Good luck, everyone.